Independent. 2 killed in Israeli strikes on southern Lebanon as West pushes to avoid all-out war with Hezbollah. Israel's foreign minister says the country is approaching the moment of all-out war against Hezbollah and Lebanon.
Israeli airstrikes killed 2 people and injured 3 others in southern Lebanon on Monday morning as world leaders rushed to de-escalate tensions and avoid another potential all-out war in the Middle East following Sunday's deadly rocket attack in the occupied Golan Heights. Israel has blamed the Iran-backed Hezbollah militant group for the rocket attack that killed 12 children and teenagers on a football pitch, making it the deadliest attack on Israel since October 7th of last year. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said his country would give a strong response to the weekend strike. The state of Israel will not and cannot let this pass. Our response will come and it will be harsh, he said according to a statement from his office released following the visit. Overnight strikes early on Monday and by Israel jets on Sunday against what the military called Hezbollah targets deep inside Lebanese territory did not appear to constitute that response, but rather part of routine exchange of fire with Hezbollah that has been going on since October. Foreign Minister Israel Katz over the weekend raised the prospect of a full-scale conflict, saying, "We are approaching the moment of an all-out war against Hezbollah in Lebanon." Israel's Defense Minister Yoav Gallant announced on Sunday that Hezbollah would bear a heavy price for their actions. Hezbollah has strongly denied responsibility for Saturday's rocket attack. While Israel's Western allies condemned the attack, world leaders also urged the Netanyahu administration to show restraint and prevent a war breaking out in the region along the ongoing Gaza conflict. Iran's foreign ministry has warned Israel against new military adventures in Lebanon, which could lead to unforeseen consequences and reactions to such stupid behavior. Any ignorant action of the Zionist regime can lead to a broadening of the scope of instability, insecurity, and war in the region, a spokesperson for the foreign ministry said. France called for everything to be done to avoid a new military escalation, as Egypt warned the attack could spill into a comprehensive regional war. The Lebanese government also condemned all acts of violence and attacks against all civilians and called for an immediate cessation of hostilities on all fronts. It said targeting civilians is a flagrant violation of international law and contradicts the principles of humanity. This is from The Intercept. Netanyahu insulted and smeared the pro-Palestine protest movement. Congress clapped. Organizers say attacks from the Israeli Prime Minister, who faces charges of war crimes, show the strength of their movement.
As thousands of protesters gathered outside the Capitol, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a joint session of the U.S. Congress and spent a significant portion of his hour-long speech attacking the U.S. pro-Palestinian protest movement with insults and misinformation. The Prime Minister went after campus protesters, drawing a false equivalence between students calling on their schools to divest from Israel and anti-Semitic attacks. He went on to insult protesters' geographical and historical knowledge of the region, in reference to the protest slogan, "From the river to the sea," and belittled the slogan, "Gays for Gaza," saying it was the same as chickens for KFC. More broadly, Netanyahu claimed that movements for Palestine liberation were choosing to stand with evil, to stand with Hamas. Hamas!
Hamas!
The Prime Minister also claimed that the pro-Palestinian movement is funded by the Iranian government, labeling protesters Iran's useful idiots without offering any evidence to substantiate his claim. The allegations of Iranian funding drew a standing ovation from many members of Congress who attended the speech, but also a splattering of boos. The comment likely stemmed from a statement released earlier this month from the White House's head of national intelligence, Avril Haines, who said they found actors tied to Iran's government posing as activists online, seeking to encourage protests and even providing financial support to protesters.
I don't know how to tell you this, but most people, if they're going to get money from Iran, they're going to be like, no, I ran the other way.
Yeah. CIA would be here so quick.
Yeah.
In the same statement, Haines clarified that Americans who protest are expressing their view on Gaza in good faith, and that her office's intelligence does not indicate otherwise. To Palestine solidarity, advocates demanding a ceasefire and an end to Israel's war, Netanyahu's attacks spoke to the power of their movement. The speech was an attempt to delegitimize a social movement that has a lot of power, that has a lot of clarity, said Benjamin Kirsten, a member of Jewish Voice for Peace, who participated in the rally outside the Capitol in Washington, D.C. on Wednesday, as well as the sit-in a day earlier in the Capitol Rotunda. It is also a distraction from what should be in focus, which is that over 39,000 people, over 14,000 children, have been killed by the Israeli government and military, making great use of United States weapons and funding.
Oh, way more people than that.
A central demand of protests around the capital during Netanyahu's visit was an arms embargo on Israel. Since October 7th, the U.S. has sent more than $12 billion in military aid to Israel, contributing to more than $141 billion in weapons to the Israeli government since the nation's formation in 1948. During his speech, Netanyahu appealed to lawmakers to fast-track military aid and invoked former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill's World War II appeal to the United States: "Give us the tools and we'll finish the job."
Oh, I got a tool for you.
He also said that sending more weapons would help keep American boots off the ground, despite the fact that American soldiers in the region have been readied for deployment to Gaza, have died in attacks related to the ongoing war, and have been actively defending Israeli targets from attack.
I just don't think he should be forgotten.
Netanyahu's appearance before Congress generated significant controversy among Democratic lawmakers, drawing detractors across the party's political spectrum, from Representative Nancy Pelosi, who said the invitation was a mistake, to Senator Bernie Sanders, who said Israel has trampled on international law, on American law, and on basic human values in its war on Gaza. More than 50 Democratic lawmakers boycotted the address in protest. Representative Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian in Congress and most vocal opponent of the event, was in attendance, holding a sign that read, "War Criminal." Her guest at the address was Hani Alamadoun, a Palestinian American and director of philanthropy at UNRWA USA, who Tlaib said had lost over 150 members of his extended family in Netanyahu's genocide. But roaring applause met Netanyahu as he walked onto the House floor, with the ovation lasting for more than 5 minutes. More clapping came after he dismissed protesters outside the Capitol, and chants of USA broke out after Netanyahu praised members of a University of North Carolina fraternity who went viral for stopping an American flag from touching the ground during campus protests in May. The fraternity members were also honored last week at the Republican National Convention. The International Criminal Court's prosecutor requested arrest warrants in May for Netanyahu and his cabinet member and defense minister Yoav Gallant on a series of war crimes, including starvation of Palestinian civilians in Gaza and the targeting civilians in its military attacks. In Congress, Netanyahu openly dismissed the ICC's case against him, defending his government's record of delivering aid to Gaza and avoiding civilian deaths. Oh my God.
I'm sorry, what record?
Hold on, what is this? This is...
Stupidity? Trumpism?
They just make your brain explode.
Alternative facts.
Yeah.
This is like Trump's alternative facts. Like, facts aren't real. This is a facts aren't real thing.
Alright.
I want to see the record of the aid that got in. I want to see the record of Palestinian lives that you personally had your people save. Not when we put them in prison.
Yeah, but what about all the medics you killed who was trying to help the Palestinians? Okay.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I gotta get through this.
That made me laugh. I'm sorry.
It
made me laugh because it's like, wait, did he just say that?
It's like baby bird brain. Like amnesia? I don't... Right.
Oh, wow.
Okay. The ICC is trying to shackle Israel's hands and prevent us from defending ourselves, Netanyahu said, before drawing a connection to the U.S., which, like Israel, is not party to the Rome Statute. If Israel's hands are tied, America's next.
You're the one doing it, bro. Maybe he has dementia and he just, forgot what's going on.
He's brain dead.
Old people. This is why old people should not be in office. Look at the fucking shit that they're doing. They're just going to kill us all because they're bored and they want to be remembered.
They're genocidal. Old people are genocidal. Protest organizers hope to shift the focus from individual actors such as Netanyahu to the broader catastrophe of Israel's treatment of Palestinians and war on Gaza. Last Friday, the International Court of Justice, the United Nations top court, ruled that Israel's occupation of the West Bank and East Jerusalem is illegal, rife with war crime violations, and amounts to apartheid. A separate ICJ case is considering whether Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. Yes, they are. Are they trying to destroy people in part or whole?
Including getting rid of their history, like blowing up their museums.
Yeah. Cultural genocide.
As well as literal life genocide.
They're trying to remove them from the area? That's genocide.
Remove them from history?
Genocide. As American taxpayers, we understand that Netanyahu is not the cause. This is not Netanyahu's war, but that he really is the symptom of a larger problem of Israeli occupation and apartheid, and now genocide, being carried out with American weapons and the support of the American government, said Kirsten. He believes that U.S. lawmakers are wrong to isolate blame to Netanyahu. What that allows is criticism of Netanyahu and no change in policy or change in behavior.
Which is fair. That means they arrest Netanyahu but never actually address what's happening.
This is from Middle East Eye. Palestinians raped and tortured in Israeli detention, says prisoners group. New details have emerged about the abuse suffered by detainees. New incidents of abuse suffered by Gaza detainees at the hands of Israeli forces have come to light following a news conference held on Monday by the Commission of Detainees Affairs, a Palestinian prisoners organization. Speakers at the press conference in Ramallah and the occupied West Bank provided updates on the conditions faced by Palestinians taken from Gaza and held in Israeli custody. Khaled Main, the Commission's lawyer, reported on his conversation with Mohammed Arab, an Al Arabi TV's Gaza correspondent, who was detained by Israeli forces during the raid on Gaza's Al Shifa hospital on March 18th. Mohammed Arab informed me of cases of rape of inmates as well as torture in front of everyone. Main spoke to Arab in Israel's Ofer prison in the West Bank, where he was recently transferred along with some prisoners from the notorious Taman detention center in Israel's Negev desert. Taman came under scrutiny after investigations and reports exposed severe torture inflicted on prisoners abducted from Gaza. Despite Israel's previous announcement to phase out the use of Taman, Main said that detainees from Gaza continued to be brought to the detention center. After speaking to Arab, Main confirmed that the conditions in Ofer are just as bad as those in Taman. Mohammed also spoke of cases of abuse where detainees were tied up to walls with dogs released to attack them, Main said. Detainees were also beaten with clubs for hours on end and beaten with pistols into their butts. In an interview with Al Arabi TV, following the press conference, Main recounted a case Arabi informed him of involving a 27-year-old detainee who was raped, forced to sleep on his stomach, attacked by police dogs, and then raped with a fire extinguisher and had the tube inserted into his butt. The extinguisher was then activated to release its contents into the man's body. Arab also reported knowing of a detainee who recently died to lack of medical care. Main stated that it was impossible to know how many Palestinians from Gaza had died in detention, as Israel is concealing this information. Fuck. This is like Nazi shit, dude. The conditions described by Main have echoed the testimonies of several Palestinian prisoners interviewed by Middle East Eye. Mohammed Arab shares a room with over 20 other Palestinians in Ofer prison, where they are forced to remain tied up even when sleeping, eating, or using the bathroom. In Taman, prisoners are allowed only 1 minute-long shower per week. Main also spoke of a case during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan in which Israeli guards tore up the Quran and trampled on it in front of the detainees. After his latest testimony to Main, Arab was interrogated by Israeli authorities and repeatedly threatened against sharing more information. Despite this, he has continued to relay messages to the lawyer. Head of the Commission of Detainees Affairs said that all Israeli institutions are complicit in the abuse of Palestinians from Gaza. All Israeli institutions, the government, the Knesset, the army, the Shin Bet, the police, and those who call themselves the Israeli judicial system are involved, he said. If an investigation is done here and there, it would just be for Israel to create misleading assumptions to the world, saying that it is a state that evaluates itself, investigates itself, and supervises its performance. This is just to mislead and hide the grave crimes.
We did an investigation. We don't support the action.
We've investigated ourselves and we've found that we've done nothing wrong.
You're a bunch of fucking disgusting pigs.
Disgusting fascist pigs. This is from Al Jazeera. War of words, as Erdogan says Turkey could intervene in Israel's war on Gaza. Turkey is again comparing Netanyahu to Hitler, while threatening more than a trade ban for the first time.
A war of words has broken out between Israel and Turkey after President Erdogan threatened its country could intervene militarily in Israel's war on Gaza. Turkish and Israeli officials unleashed barbs at one another on Sunday and Monday after Erdogan said in a speech on Sunday that there is no reason that Turkey could not act, noting military interventions made in the past in other countries. While crude rhetoric between the two countries has been regular amid the war in Gaza, the threats and insults come as fears of the wider escalation rise once again. Shortly after Erdogan's speech, Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz said in a post on X that the Turkish president was following in the footsteps of former Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein by threatening to attack Israel. Just let him remember what happened there and how it ended, he wrote in reference to the Iraqi president's famous 2003 capture by United States forces while hiding in a hole in the ground near a farmhouse in Tikrit, Hussein was later executed. They're like, how dare you call us Hitler? We don't do evil things. And then they're like, do you remember what happened to Saddam Hussein? He said bad things about us and that the United States took care of it for us.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that? Remember how we made the United States take care of it for us?
Yep.
In retaliation, Turkey, not for the first time, compared Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to Adolf Hitler. Just as genocidal Hitler ended, so will genocidal Netanyahu.
Damn, it's crazy when you're like ministers of foreign affairs are just like talking mad shit on X back and forth.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm like, can we like not do that? Just as the genocidal Nazis were held accountable, so will those who try to destroy the Palestinians. The post continued. Humanity will stand by the Palestinians. You will not be able to destroy the Palestinians. In a post on X on Monday, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan boasted that Erdogan has become the voice of humanity's conscience.
Erdogan's a dictator. Shit. So.
Well, you know, even dictators can be like, yo, what they're doing over there is like what we do is not cool, but like what they're doing over there, like that's actual genocide, guys. Like
They're kind of like, hey, we're not great, but look at that.
We oppress our people.
You see that over there?
But we didn't do that. We still extradite Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
90-year-old Nazis.
Mm-hmm.
But we're letting this happen. International Zionist circles, especially Israel, who want to suppress the righteous voice, are in great alarm. History ended the same way for all genociders and their supporters. Turkey restricted some exports to Israel in April, 6 months into the war on Gaza, and said it halted trade with Israel altogether in early May. Israel said it would scrape the country's free trade agreement with Turkey in retaliation, with Israeli Finance Minister Smotrich signaling the move is reversible when Erdogan's name sounds like you should be a Star Wars person, like a Padawan.
Yeah. His name was wasted. Like, he's a shit person, but his name's cool.
Yeah. When Erdogan is replaced by a leader who is sane and not a hater of Israel. Lol.
They're just haters, you guys.
Stop being haters.
Why? They're just haters. We just bomb children. Why would you hate on us for bombing children? You don't need to do DMT or some shit, okay?
As in, you need to take your last dose of life.
Yeah.
I know it's real long.
Naturally secrete DMT soon, please. This is from the San Francisco Chronicle. No more excuses. Gavin Newsom directs California cities to clear homeless encampments.
Governor Gavin Newsom is pushing California cities to more aggressively clear homeless encampments in the wake of the U.S. Supreme Court ruling freeing cities from restrictions on doing so. On Thursday morning, he issued an executive order directing state agencies and urging local governments to adopt policies to identify dangerous encampments and clear them after giving residents 2 days' notice. The move comes as California's challenges, including its homelessness crisis, are under the microscope nationally because Democrats are poised to nominate Vice President Kamala Harris as their presidential candidate. Conservatives are already seizing on Harris's long track record as an elected official in the Golden State, arguing she bears responsibility for California's problems. The California state government has dealt with the proliferation of tents along state highways for years. Newsom previously detailed his frustration to the Chronicle about how his and local officials' hands were tied because courts had limited government's ability to clear homelessness encampments, arguing that punishing people for sleeping outside amounted to unfair punishment. That's because it is. That dynamic shifted last month when the Supreme Court ruled that government officials have broad power to evict people from street encampments and confiscate their property because they have so fucking much already. Let's just take it away from them.
Cops need it. Feed their families.
ACAB. Wait, can we use ACAB against Kamala?
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there.
She's a cop.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Newsom's executive order directs state agencies to adopt policies in line with those already in place at the California Department of Transportation, which oversees state highway property and has long grappled with encampments. Those policies include giving people 48 hours notice to evacuate before their encampments are cleared, except in extreme circumstances, contacting service organizations to connect with people living in the encampment, and collecting, labeling, and storing property cleared from the site for at least 60 days. This executive order directs state agencies to move urgently to address dangerous encampments while supporting and assisting the individuals living in them. Fucking liar. Newsom wrote, noting that although his administration has directed $24 billion towards addressing homelessness since he took office in 2019, the problem is still acute. There are simply no more excuses, he wrote in the statement. It's time for everyone to do their part. I agree. And to start by doing your part, sir, you should probably consider UBI. Consider all the houses that you currently have that are just kind of like sitting and collecting dust and gathering weeds. Maybe you should look into a housing for those homeless people. Let's see, let's help with the water, let's help with the electric, let's help with their food. Let's get actual people in there to fucking help them into getting jobs or whatever may have been what ultimately put them in that homeless situation in the first place. Let's do those things instead of, hey, cop, how would you like to beat up some homeless people?
But like half of the cop's job is just like state violence on homeless people, so
So basically, if you're just a violent person, oh, that's why cops beat up on their wives. Oh, so if they don't get a beat up on a minority, then they beat up on their wives instead.
well, beat on both of them.
Depends on
They
how
have all
bad
the
it
power. They're used to being in the power position.
San Francisco Mayor London Breed announced shortly after the Supreme Court ruling that she intended to escalate homeless sweeps as a result. Jeff Creighton, is he a Creighton?
Yep.
That's perfect. You have the best name, bro. Jeff Creighton, her spokesperson, said Newsom is calling for what SF is already doing. He said the city expects an injunction that has restricted some of the city's encampment work to be officially lifted as soon as Monday. Our encampment teams have been going out and will continue to go out to bring people indoors and to clean and clear encampments, Creighton said. We have been training our workforce to be ready once the court officially lifts the injunctions.
Do you think there would be encampments if they could just go to the fucking house, their own fucking house? Sorry.
I mean, if you look at the fact that homelessness took off with COVID, maybe we should, I don't know, take into consideration that it's not just people not pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. Maybe they're not just lazy.
Basically, all that means is they've already done the shit that they're allowed to do now. They've already been doing it and getting in trouble for doing it. But now they're no longer going to be getting in trouble for doing it, so they're going to do it even more. Is basically what they're saying. They're basically bragging about this shit that you weren't going to let us do, that we've been doing this whole time. Now you just fucking do it.
Harold Duffy, Oakland's acting homelessness administrator, said Newsom's order won't meaningfully affect what the city is already doing, which is leaning harder into clearing camps while offering shelter and services.
Your shelter and services must fucking suck if they'd rather live in a goddamn encampment.
Well, I mean, a jail cell isn't really a shelter.
Prison labor. That's what they need.
Oh, that's why he's doing it. They need firefighters.
Yep, they need more firefighters, guys.
Get it.
Yeah, Kamala, that scandal's coming for you. Can't pay.
The Supreme Court ruling gave us a little more leeway, he said, but one of the main goals of any sweep will be on safety, like clearing tents away from buildings and power poles to reduce fire danger, he said. Oh, that's what's starting their fires is homeless people. Well, it's almost like we should have them in a house. Our emphasis is on getting people into housing, liar. Our emphasis is on getting people into housing, getting them help, he said.
Then buy up the houses and put them in there. Put your money where your fucking mouth is. Buy the goddamn houses and put them in there.
Santa Clara County and the city of San Jose are also crafting plans on more aggressively compel people to accept shelter and services. But a recent proposal to criminalize camping along local waterways met such resistance that officials are taking a cautious approach. The Santa Clara Valley Water District this month delayed implementing a policy that would impose $500 fines or up to 30 days in jail on anyone setting up an encampment along its waterways after getting intensive public pushback. So how are you going to do a $500 fine on somebody who literally has nothing? If they had $500, do you think they would sleep do you think they would be sleeping in a tent on the street, or do you think they would rent a fucking $29, $59 hotel room to stay safe for the night? Instead of Newsom, we should say, can we get someone new? Until we actually permanently get those folks off the streets and into housing, complaints and sweeps are not going to end, said Ray Bramson, Chief Operating Officer of Destination Home Santa Clara, County's leading nonprofit addressing homelessness. It's not ramping up punitive approaches and moving people around that will solve this. The Bay Area Council, a business-oriented nonprofit, applauded Newsom for his decisive action. California cities must now rise to meet this movement, to grab this opportunity and provide the shelter and housing that can end our long homelessness nightmare and restore a sense of order and civility to our streets, sidewalks, and other public spaces. Council President Jim Wunderman said in a statement, "This is not about criminalizing the unhoused, it's about meeting our responsibility to help our neighbors."
Except it's exactly what it's exactly what it's about.
Exactly,
Okay.
that's what I'm like.
Let's just say the opposite of what we're actually doing and pretend like that's what we're doing. It's just like, it's basically spin. It's like things are getting worse, but it's not so bad when we say it like this.
But let's all just remember that statistically, everyone is closer to homelessness than they are to being a billionaire. So
The homeless are your comrades. Billionaires are not.
it's not that hard to hit homeless. Every American's only like a $400 emergency away from not being able to afford their bills. I mean, all it takes is the breadwinner or, one of the spouses, half the income, somebody to die. That's all it takes. Just that one sudden thing, and now you can't afford your mortgage. So now you lost your house. And then things just spiral down from there, and you end up homeless. Why? Because COVID took your loved one.
For any reason, really.
I mean, yeah, any reason, but I'm just saying, like, it's something people think that, like, I don't know, just so many people, there's so much stigma around homelessness that it's all because they're just lazy people that don't want to work. All they do is do drugs and drink. But you know what? We all, even as the working class, do drugs and drink. Some of them prescription drugs, some of them illegal drugs, some of them legal drugs. But we all do it because we're all trying to numb the pain of the fact that we're all being just pushed down, and we're all just being, what do you call it?
Alienated and coerced. And
Oppressed. We're all being oppressed because we all know that we could live better lives. Who wants to?
This is called class warfare.
There's a meme that I like a lot that says, "Do you believe in life after work?" Just kind of think about that for a second. The Supreme Court ruling issued last month determined that enforcing laws regulating camping on public property does not constitute cruel and unusual punishment prohibited by the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. The court's 6 conservative justices sided in the majority, while the 3 liberal justices dissented. The court's majority argued that not only do most American cities, including those in the Bay Area, already have anti-urban camping laws, but no more than 41% of unhoused people readily accept services or shelter when offered them during sweeps. The ruling quoted Breed saying her city uses anti-camping laws not to criminalize homelessness, but as one important tool to encouraging people to accept services and ensure safe and accessible sidewalks and public spaces. Some suggest that homelessness may be the defining public health and safety crisis in the western United States today. Justice Neil Gorsuch wrote for the majority, the causes are varied and complex, the appropriate public policy responses perhaps no less so. In dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor said Grants Pass, Oregon, the city where the case originated, was punishing people for their status of homelessness. Sleep is a biological necessity, not a crime, wrote Sonia, joined by the other 2 liberal justices. For some people, sleeping outside is their only option. The city of Grants Pass jails and fines those people for sleeping anywhere in public at any time, including in their cars. If they use as little as a blanket to keep warm or a rolled up shirt as a pillow, for people with no access to shelter, that punishes them for being homeless. That's unconscionable and unconstitutional. I've fallen asleep in my car before. For longtime advocates of homeless people, the court ruling and attendant efforts by cities to lean harder on sweeps changes little. What it does is take off the gloves and validates what communities have been doing anyways, says Paul Bowden, head of the Western Regional Advocacy Project. There's no more pretense now that we're giving them referrals. It's just full speed ahead. Eric Tars, Senior Policy Director for the National Homelessness Law Center, said that the order is misguided if it doesn't come alongside new housing resources. The only way to end encampment in California is to end the need for encampments, Tars said. This executive order is attempting to misdirect people's attention from the government's failure to solve the affordable housing crisis and put the blame and punishment for the failure onto the very victims of that failure. Tars said that while the Supreme Court decision closed one avenue for legal advocacy, it acknowledges that homeless people still have other legal protections. So as we are able to evaluate the executive order and its potential impacts, we will see if any of those other protections might need to be applied here, he said.
The unhoused deserve dignity too. The working class will always be close to homelessness as long as capitalism is allowed to continue. That is by design. The suffering of working people and the unhoused serve capitalists at the end of the day, creating unfavorable situations forcing people into contracts and employment they otherwise would not do. You having less options and freedom serves the status quo. Desperation in the job market allows companies to continue to pay low wages, work long hours, for a boss or a few people that hoard all the profits by exploiting your value. The unhoused need homes. It's that simple. Put the unhoused into homes. It's that simple. Largest jump in homelessness year over year occurred last year with a 12% jump. Not to mention, housing the unhoused would save taxpayers money. The only reason we don't have a housing first policy in this country is purely because of ideological barriers.
This is from Anadolu Njanzi. African intellectuals remember late Muammar Gaddafi as Pan-African. Gaddafi had a strong vision of uniting the continent to be self-reliant.
African Intellectuals Wednesday remembered late Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi, who was killed on October 20th, 2011, as a Pan-African who had the best interest of the continent at heart. Gaddafi had a vision and strong belief of uniting Africans, Sultan Kakuba, a political scientist at Kayambogo University in Uganda, told interviewers. He believed a united Africa would speak with one voice at international fora such as the United Nations and manage to bargain and be seen as an equal partner. Kakuba claimed Gaddafi was seen as an enemy of Western countries because of his longing for a United States of Africa, which he pushed for many years, hoping one day to have a unified African government. Gaddafi believed this was the only way for Africa could develop without Western interference, he said. Mustafa Mehta, a Johannesburg-based researcher, said he equally believes Gaddafi was killed because of his objection to Western interference in African affairs. I think Gaddafi was murdered for standing up to the West, and for trying to promote very progressive ideas for Africa, which the West don't like. They want a forever dependent Africa, Mehta said. In speeches, Gaddafi often outlined his plan to create a new united Africa with its own currency, an army to defend the continent, and a single passport. He wanted to introduce a gold dinar to back African currencies, thus freeing them from the dollar standard. Gaddafi also longed to protect Africa's natural resources from what he referred to as Western looters.
Go Gaddafi.
Hillary killed him. Despite being a darling of most African countries, a record of human rights abuses and corruption in his own country turned many Libyans against Gaddafi. And when the winds of 2011 Arab Spring reached Libya, people held mass protests against him, Western armies an opportunity to move in. Regime change time.
And then we get to pick the next one, and the next one, and the next one, and the next one.
Jasset, an executive member of the Johannesburg-based think tank Media Review Network, said that Gaddafi's support for anti-colonial struggles, especially the military and financial support provided to South Africa's liberation movements, endeared him to all who opposed to white minority rule. Being at odds with the dominant Western worldview saw him targeted for what they perceived as supporting terrorism, said Jasset. Despite being seen as a Pan-African who sought African unity, Gaddafi was also accused of backing notorious rebel groups in Libya and Sierra Leone, among others. As much as he was despised by the West, particularly France, Italy, Britain, and America, he was also viewed as a threat to some African regimes, Jasset said. He said this explains why organs of the continent, such as the African Union, looked on without a whimper of protest in 2011 when Western armies were pummeling Libya with bombs. Most academics who spoke to Anadolu Agency argued that the March 19, 2011 NATO-led military intervention in Libya was unjustifiable because it plunged the country into total chaos. The Western invasion, which culminated in the assassination of Muammar Gaddafi, is responsible for what is currently prevailing in Libya, said Mehta. Kakuba agreed that Western countries should have left the African Union to resolve the situation in Libya, giving the continental body an opportunity to solve an African problem. The invasion of Libya created a scenario in which Africans cannot solve their own problems. The West should have left the African Union to resolve the crisis in Libya, he said.
Stop sticking our noses in other people's fucking business.
That's what people have been telling us for
Ever.
80 years now. Jasset faulted some African countries, saying they let down Libya by voting with the UN Security Council in their resolution to bomb Libya. He said South Africa also marred its reputation for failing to intervene and prevent the destruction of an ally. Jasset said that South Africa had the rest of the continent responsibility for allowing former colonizers to triumphantly dismember a leading and successful Libya. On March 17, 2011, South Africa, a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, voted for Resolution 1973, which authorized military intervention in Libya, allowing a NATO-led coalition to conduct fierce airstrikes against Gaddafi's forces. However, the country later condemned the bombing, saying NATO forces had distorted the mandate of the resolution by trying to topple Gaddafi instead of remaining neutral and protecting civilians. The African Union also expressed reservations over the NATO bombings. Gaddafi's death led to nearly a decade of civil war. This is from NBC News. Ugly past of U.S. human experiments uncovered.
Shocking as it may seem, U.S. government doctors once thought it was fine to experiment on disabled people and prison inmates. Such experiments included giving hepatitis to mental patients in Connecticut, squirting a pandemic flu virus up the noses of prisoners in Maryland, and injecting cancer cells in chronically ill people at a New York hospital. Much of this horrific history is 40 to 80 years old, but it is the backdrop for a meeting in Washington this week by a presidential bioethics commission. The meeting was triggered by the government's apology last fall for federal doctors infecting prisoners and mental patients in Guatemala with syphilis 65 years ago. U.S. officials also acknowledged there have been dozens of similar experiments in the United States, studies that often involved making healthy people sick. An exhaustive review by the Associated Press of medical journal reports and decades-old press clippings found more than 40 such studies. At best, these were a search for life-saving treatments. At worst, some amounted to curiosity-satisfying experiments that hurt people but provided no useful results. Inevitably, they will be compared to the well-known Tuskegee syphilis study. In that episode, U.S. health officials tracked 600 black men in Alabama who already had syphilis but didn't give them adequate treatment even after penicillin became available. These studies were worse in at least one respect. They violated the concept of first do no harm, a fundamental medical principle that stretches back centuries. When you give somebody a disease, even by the standards of their time, you really cross the key ethical norm of the profession, said Arthur Kaplan, director of the University of Pennsylvania Center for Bioethics. Some of these studies, mostly from the 1940s to the 60s, apparently were never covered by the news media. Others were reported at the time, but the focus was on the promising of enduring new cures while glossing over how test subjects were treated. Attitudes about medical research were different then. Infectious disease killed many more people years ago, and doctors worked urgently to invent and test cures. Many prominent researchers felt it was legitimate to experiment on people who did not have full rights in society. People like prisoners, mental patients, poor blacks. It was an attitude in some ways similar to that of Nazi doctors experimenting on Jews. There was definitely a sense that we don't have today that sacrifice for the nation was important, said Laura Stark, a Wesleyan University assistant professor of science and society, who is writing a book about past federal medical experiments. The AP review of past research found a federally funded study began in 1942, injected experimental flu vaccine in male patients at a state insane asylum in Michigan, then exposed them to flu several months later. It was co-authored by Dr. Jonas Salk, who a decade later would become famous as the inventor of the polio vaccine. Some of the men weren't able to describe their symptoms, raising serious questions about how well they understood what was being done to them. One newspaper account mentioned the test subjects were senile and debilitated. Then it quickly moved on to the promising results. In federally funded studies in the 1940s, noted researcher Dr. W. Paul Havens Jr. exposed men to hepatitis in a series of experiments, including one using patients from mental institutions in Middletown, Newark, Connecticut. Havens, a World Health Organization expert on viral diseases, was one of the first scientists to differentiate types of hepatitis and their causes. A search of various news archives found no mention of the mental patient study, which made 8 healthy men ill but broke no new ground in understanding the disease. Researchers in the middle 1940s studied the transmission of a deadly stomach bug by having young men swallow unfiltered stool suspension. Ew. Researchers in the mid-1940s studied the transmission of a deadly stomach bug by having young men swallow unfiltered stool suspension. The study was conducted at the New York State Vocational Institution. That doesn't sound like a bad place. The New York State Vocational Institution. The point was to see how well the disease spread that way as compared to spraying the germs and having test subjects breathe it. Swallowing it was a more effective way to spread the disease, the researchers concluded. The study doesn't explain if the men were rewarded for this awful task. The University of Minnesota study in the late 1940s injected 11 public service employees, volunteers with malaria, then starved them for 5 days. Some were also subjected to hard labor, and those men lost an average of 14 pounds. They were treated for malaria fevers with quinine sulfate. One of the authors was Ansel Keys, a noted dietary scientist who developed K-rations for the military and the Mediterranean diet for the public. But a search of various news archives found no mention of the study. For a study in 1957, when the Asian flu pandemic was spreading, federal researchers sprayed the virus into the noses of 23 inmates at a prison in Jessup, Maryland, to compare the reactions to those of 32 virus-exposed inmates who had been given a new vaccine. Government researchers in the 1950s tried to infect about 24 volunteering prison inmates with gonorrhea using 2 different methods in an experiment at a federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Oh God. The bacteria was pumped directly into the urinary tract through the penis, according to the paper. Ew. The men quickly developed the disease. Duh. Let me just shoot something into your pee-pee hole and see if it works.
The real man, Lucy.
The men quickly developed the disease, but the researchers noted that this method wasn't comparable to how men normally got infected, by having sex with an infected partner. The men were later treated with antibiotics. The study was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, but there was no mention of it in various news archives. Though people in the studies were usually described as volunteers, historians and ethics have questioned how well these people understood what was being done to them and why, or whether they were coerced. Prisoners have long been victimized for the sake of science. In 1915, the U.S. government's Dr. Joseph Goldenberg, today remembered as a public health hero, recruited Mississippi inmates to go on special rations to prove his theory that the painful illness pellagra was caused by a dietary deficiency. The men were offered pardons for their participation. But studies using prisoners were uncommon in the first few decades of the 20th century, and usually performed by researchers considered eccentric even by the standards of that day. One was Dr. L.L. Stanley, resident physician at San Quentin Prison in California, who around 1920 attempted to treat older devitalized men by implanting in them testicles from livestock and recently executed convicts. Newspapers wrote about Stanley's experiments, but the lack of outrage is striking. Enter San Quentin Penitentiary in the role of the fountain of youth, an institution where the years are made to roll back for men of failing mentality and vitality, is restored to the step, wit to the brain, vigor to the muscles, and ambition to the spirit. All this has been done, is being done, by a surgeon with a scalpel, began one Rosary report published in November 1919 in the Washington Post. Around the time of World War II, prisoners were enlisted to help the war effort by taking part in studies that could help the troops. For example, a series of malaria studies at Stateville Penitentiary in Illinois and 2 other prisons was designed to test anti-malarial drugs that could help soldiers fighting in the Pacific. It was about this time that prosecution of Nazi doctors in 1947 led to Nuremberg Code, a set of international rules to protect human test subjects. Many U.S. doctors essentially ignored them, arguing that they applied to Nazi atrocities, not to American medicine. The late 1940s and 1950s saw huge growth in the U.S. pharmaceutical and healthcare industries, accompanied by a boom in prisoner experiments funded by both the government and corporations. By the 1960s, at least half the states allowed prisoners to be used as medical guinea pigs. But 2 studies in the 1960s proved to be turning points in the public's attitude toward the way test subjects were treated. The first came to light in 1963. Researchers injected cancer cells into 19 old and debilitated patients at a Jewish chronic disease hospital in the New York borough of Brooklyn to see if their bodies would reject them. The hospital director said the patients were not told they were being injected with cancer cells because there was no need. The cells were deemed harmless. But the experiment upset a lawyer named William Hyman, who sat on the hospital's board of directors. The state investigated, and the hospital ultimately said any such experiments would require the patient's written consent. At nearby Staten Island from 1963 to 1966, a controversial medical study was conducted at the Willowbrook State School for Children with Mental Retardation. The children were intentionally given hepatitis orally and by injection to see if they could then be cured with gamma globulin. Those two studies, along with the Tuskegee experiment revealed in 1972, proved to be a holy trinity that sparked extensive and critical media coverage and public disgust, said Susan Riverby, the Wellesley College historian who first discovered records of the syphilis study in Guatemala. By the early 1970s, even experiments involving prisoners were considered scandalous. In widely covered controversial hearings in 1973, pharmaceutical industry officials acknowledged they were using prisoners for testing because they were cheaper than chimpanzees. Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia made extensive use of inmates for medical experiments. Some of the victims are still around to talk about it. Edward Yusuf Anthony, featured in a book about the studies, says he agreed to have a layer of skin peeled off his back, which was coated with searing chemicals to test a drug. He did that for money to buy cigarettes in prison. I said, "Oh my God, my back is on fire. Take this off me." Anthony said in an interview with the Associated Press as he recalled the beginning of weeks of intense itching and agonizing pain. The government responded with reforms, among them the U.S. Bureau of Prisons in the mid-1970s effectively excluded all research by drug companies and other outside agencies within federal prisons. As the supply of prisoners and mental patients dried up, researchers looked to other countries. It made sense. Clinical trials could be done more cheaply and with fewer rules. And it was easy to find patients who were taking no medication, a factor that can complicate tests of other drugs. Additional sets of ethical guidelines have been enacted, and few believe that another Guatemala study could happen today. It's not that we're out infecting anybody with things, Kaplan said. Still, in the last 15 years, 2 international studies sparked outrage. One was linked to Tuskegee. U.S.-funded doctors failed to give the AIDS drug AZT to all the HIV-infected pregnant women in a study in Uganda, even though it would have protected their newborns. U.S. health officials argued the study would answer questions about AZT's use in the developing world. The other study by Pfizer Inc. gave an antibiotic named Trovin to children with meningitis in Nigeria, although there were doubts about its effectiveness for that disease. Critics blamed the experiment for the deaths of 11 children and the disabling of scores of others. Pfizer settled a lawsuit with Nigerian officials for $75 million, but admitted no wrongdoing. Of course not, it's Pfizer. Last year, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Inspector General reported that between 40 and 65% of clinical studies of federally regulated medical products were done in other countries in 2008, and that proportion probably has grown. The report also noted that U.S. regulators inspected fewer than 1% of foreign clinical trial sites. Monitoring research is complicated, and rules that are too rigid could slow new drug development. But it's often hard to get information on international trials, sometimes because of missing records and a paucity of audits, said Dr. Kevin Schulman, a Duke University professor of medicine who has written on the ethics of international studies. These issues were still being debated when last October the Guatemala study came to light. Really? Just last October? Jesus.
This is a 15-year-old article.
Okay.
It's from 2011.
In the 1946 to 1948 study, American scientists infected prisoners and patients in a mental hospital in Guatemala with syphilis, apparently to test whether penicillin could prevent some sexually transmitted disease. The study came up with no useful information and was hidden for decades. The Guatemala study nauseated ethicists on multiple levels. Beyond infecting patients with a terrible illness, it was clear that people in the study did not understand what was being done to them or were not able to give their consent. Indeed, though it happened at a time when scientists were quick to publish research that showed frank disinterest in the rights of study participants, this study was buried in file drawers. It was unusually unethical even at the time, said Stark, the Wesleyan researcher. When the president was briefed on the details of the Guatemalan episode, one of his first questions was whether this sort of thing could still happen today, said Rick Wise, a spokesman for the White House official of Science and Technology Policy. That it occurred overseas was an opening for the Obama administration to have the bioethics panel seek a new evaluation of international medical studies. The president also asked the Institute of Medicine to further probe the Guatemala study, but the IOM relinquished the assignment in November after reporting its own conflict of interest. In the 1940s, 5 members of one of the IOM's sister organizations played prominent roles in federal syphilis research and had links to the Guatemala study.
Well, we thought America was infallible and innocent.
I was like, Grady again, start touching on people.
I made Grady again, like what, experiment on prisoners in the mental institution?
No, we just want to give back people drugs to see what happens.
We just want to see what happens, guys.
This is from PBS News, the often misunderstood legacy of the Black Panther Party. In the 1960s civil rights movement, some concluded that nonviolence and the focus on integration had failed. Their cry was Black Power, rather than We Shall Overcome. One of the most prominent of these groups was the Black Panther Party, and it was also perhaps one of the most misunderstood and vilified by the white establishment. We take a closer look for a Hidden History series.
The Black Panther Party was revolutionary in both its goals and its tactics. It began in 1966 in response to both the assassination of Malcolm X, a leading advocate of black separatism, and the killing of an unarmed black 16-year-old named Matthew Johnson during a San Francisco police stop. Founders Bobby Seale and Huey Newton were college students at the time. We have a Black Panther Party. As long as the evil Tetra and corrupt officials, as long as the oppressor makes the laws, the people are not bound to respect them. We are bound to transform society and erect a system where people will receive justice. Huey Newton, co-founder of Black Panther Party. Their 10-point program leaned heavily on Marxism. They saw black American struggles. In America, black people are treated very much as the Vietnamese people are any other colonized people, because where you were brutalized, the police in our community occupy our area. Our community, as a foreign troop, occupies territory, Newton said. The Black Panther Party provided community services called survival programs to promote self-determination, free food, especially breakfast for school children, free health care, and voter registration drives. They established schools in 9 cities. Women made up nearly half of the Panther membership of about 2,000, and they often held leadership roles. From 1974 until 1977, Elaine Brown was the head of the National Party, but it was the group's paramilitary displays that drew the white establishment's attention and alarm. Members patrolled neighborhoods with black jackets and black berets, openly and legally carrying weapons. For many white Americans, a photo of stern-looking Newton holding a rifle and a spear became the image of the Black Panthers. It's crazy, like, everyone's rah-rah Second Amendment until they see a black man with a rifle. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called the party the greatest threat to internal security and ordered surveillance to expose, disrupt, misdirect, discredit, and otherwise neutralize the Black Panthers. Tensions with local police led to deadly clashes. In Chicago, a police raid killed rising party star Fred Hampton and party member Mark Clark. In 1982, the federal government paid $1.8 million to settle a lawsuit alleging that the FBI had a role in the Chicago raid. Plagued by internal disputes and power struggles, the party was essentially defunct by the late 1970s. It was formally disbanded in 1982. Party members are among the first to openly challenge police violence, often converging on the same scene when officers stopped young black men on the streets. Donna Murch, author, Living for the City. I think the greatest legacy was a youth movement, a young organization composed mainly of people in their late teens and early 20s, working class youth, that had migrated from the South, who found themselves having unprecedented access to high school and college in California. And out of that, they helped form a study group and create a new type of organization and youth movement that was focused on serving the community. It started with confronting police violence, because that's what the community saw as the biggest single problem. This is the era of the urban rebellions, you know. The party was formed a year after Watts, and they were willing to perform a form of activism in order to empower others. But very quickly, after police patrols, the Panthers shifted into something called survival pending revolution, which meant founding free breakfast programs, freedom schools, and the longest running institution of the Black Panther Party was a school in Oakland that ran for almost a decade. I think one of the best ways to understand the Panther Party is to think about the Black Freedom Movement as having a large geography and time period. So the party was formed a year after the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But you know, the dismantling of legal segregation in the South did not dismantle the problems of economics and access in the North and in the West. And one of the central issues about this was both police violence and people not having equal access to the social welfare state. So I would describe the Panthers as emerging in this moment, post-civil rights, after the accomplishments of the civil rights movement, of the successful passage of the Civil Rights Act and also the Voting Rights Act. But I would be remiss not to talk about the global link to the Panthers. They formed in 1966, and this is after over a decade of decolonization of African countries winning their independence. And also, very importantly, they look to Asia. The Panthers are formed in Northern California, and they were adamant in their opposition to the Vietnam War and American imperialism. They identified with the Vietnamese, the Viet Minh and the Ho Chi Minh, and they actually looked a lot to Vietnam, to China, and to a vision of anti-colonialism and a socialist state that would serve the people. So I think that's one of the most important contexts. The other thing I really want to stress is that the popular representations of the Panthers are wrong. So many people find out about the Panthers through Forrest Gump. They're represented as anti-white black militants. But the truth is that the party of all the 60s organizations, they had the strongest ties to creating a multiracial coalition, what was called in this period the Rainbow Coalition that Jesse Jackson later picks up on. So they united with white radical youth, who they called Mother Country Radicals, to oppose the Vietnam War. And this was incredibly threatening to the government at the time. J. Edgar Hoover in particular, because you basically saw a multiracial coalition uniting to stop anti-communism and violence in the global south. So I think that would also be the Panthers' legacy, a model of multiracial coalition building. They were arguing that the social welfare state as it existed was not serving the people, and that they as teenagers could provide free breakfast. And when they started their freedom schools, many of the low-income children who went to Panther schools had not had breakfast, and they couldn't learn. And so they were shaming the state. And although we don't have direct documentary evidence, it is thought that by many scholars that shaming of the state prompted the issuing of free school lunch, she said. It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love and protect one another. We have nothing to lose but our chains.